change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Exodus. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And so Raul, he invites him to be a part of his family. And so now Moses, he's like his own son. And I would imagine it would have been great to have Moses around because Moses knew so many things. You really couldn't have had a more interesting person living in your home. It's kind of like having the champion of Jeopardy, that game show, living in your house. Because Moses, he knew everything. So Moses is not the kind of guy you want to play Trivial Pursuit with. And Moses, he liked living there. And it says he was content. But we do kind of get an understanding of what's going on in Moses' heart. And we get that by what he names his son, Gershom, which means, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. So Moses, he still feels like a stranger here, and he misses his own people. So this really isn't the life that Moses wanted to live. But Moses doesn't really ever see it changing, and he's settled there. And though he's content, he's not fulfilled. And Moses is there for a long time, because just between these two verses, between verse 22 and 23, it's been another 40 years. So for 40 years, Moses has been in the wilderness, and he's been on the backside of the desert. And I believe that this kind of wilderness experience called the backside of the desert is something that all of us as God's people have to go through. Because this is the place where we become broken and not just humble, but humbled. This is where you learn the things you won't learn in Egypt. And in the Bible, Egypt is always a type of the world. So the backside of the desert is the things that you don't learn from the world. And this is where all our goals and all our own plans for our own lives, where they're not gone, but they become surrendered to God. And the desert isn't fun, but it is where we grow deep. And it's where God takes away things, and then he puts new things in us, things that we could get no other way. And so Moses, he learns things in the desert. And even though he doesn't really know it, and even though he thinks right now his life is being a waste, but what he learns is he learns how to live in a desert wilderness. So he lives like the Bedouins. He learns how to live in a tent. He learns where all the wells of water are and how to find them. And he knows where sheep can graze, where there's not places to graze sheep. And it's all these kind of things that the children of Israel are going to need to know when they get out of Egypt. They follow Moses because the children of Israel, they don't know these things anymore, because it's going to be actually in this exact same place in just a few years that there's going to be over 2 million of them. And all the children of Israel, they've never lived like this for about 400 years since Jacob left Canaan, where he lived in tents. But I'm pretty sure that Moses, he didn't feel like he was learning anything and that his whole life was a waste. So now in verse 23, it's been 40 years since Moses fled from Egypt. And we read that the king of Egypt dies. And it says that all the children of Israel groaned because of their bondage and that they cried out. And that word groaned here, that's the word that's used for having broken arms. And now here, the Bible, after emphasizing of how bad this bondage of the children of Israel actually was, God himself now becomes the subject of this passage. Because now here it uses the name God 5 times. And it's emphasizing that God is involved with these people. And it says, God heard, God remembered, God looked upon, and God acknowledged them. And that word acknowledged here, it doesn't mean that God is just aware of their circumstances, that he just knew about it, but that God had a personal concern about them. And so now in chapter 3, we see that Moses, he didn't even have his own sheep, but that he tended his father-in-law's flock. And here we read that his father-in-law is now called Jethro. And you just can't read this and not think of Jethro Bodine of the Beverly Hillbillies. But I don't believe that this man was anything like that. And so here he's not called Raul like before. And what's thought here is that Jethro is his title. That may be his official title of being the priest of Midian, because Jethro means excellence. And Raul, it just means friend of God. And it is believed that Raul, that he also served that same God of Abraham, because he is also a descendant of Abraham through Keturah. And so it says that Moses, he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And so this may have been the place where Jethro, he offered those sacrifices. And Horeb is thought to mean something like desert or desolation, and that it's really just a description of the area that's around there, about that kind of desolate wilderness. And Mount Horeb is also known as Mount Sinai, and its location has been disputed. So if you go to Israel, most of the tour guides will point to Mount Sinai as being located in the Sinai Peninsula, which is part of Egypt. But it's most probably in Saudi Arabia, because the Apostle Paul, he says that that's where he went, that he went to Arabia when he went to Mount Sinai, and that's where he went when he was first converted. And so this has been the area probably where Jethro offered his sacrifices to God for the people. And it doesn't seem unusual for God to have Moses learn how to be a shepherd, because the skills in being a shepherd and the leading of sheep is a lot like how you would lead people, because it teaches a shepherd tolerance, and it teaches them how to be patient without being cruel, and to care for those that they're caring for, because sheep are stubborn, but they're also timid, and they're very dependent. They can't survive on their own, and it's all because they're not that bright. But Moses, he gets his fill of it. And it's just like how these sheep, they don't belong to Moses. The children of Israel, they don't belong to Moses either. They belong to God, and those will be God's sheep. And so 40 years tending sheep alone with all your own thoughts, it gives you some time to get some thinking done, and to mull things over and to meditate of what's important and what's a waste. And in Egypt, Moses learned to be a somebody, but in the wilderness of Midian, he learned to be a nobody. And so his mind, it probably often traveled back to Egypt and to those slaves and to their oppression. And he probably thought about how he had failed them. And if Moses was a praying man, he probably prayed for them, because his family is still back there. And we know that he carried a burden for them. But he's woke to the fact that there was nothing that he can do for them. And so Moses, he sees this fire on the mountain of God. And to see a fire in the mountains is probably not too unusual. And we don't know how long he's been out there with his sheep. But this fire, it just kept burning, but it didn't spread and it didn't burn itself out. And so maybe he spent like a half a day out there just looking up there and watching and seeing nothing change. And so maybe he might have thought it was like some kind of mirage or some type of reflected sunlight. But whatever it was, it caught his interest, because he had never seen anything like this in his 40 years of shepherding. And a lot of people find a lot of symbolism in the burning bush. Some will say, well, it's a picture of Israel. It's that they're suffering, but they're the light of the world without ever being consumed. And some people, they think it's a picture of Moses, that Moses is this weak bush, but he's being empowered by the fire. And I don't know. I just think it was just a way to get Moses' attention. Just that it wasn't something that you saw every day. So I'm imagining that Moses, he watched it from a distance for a while. And it says that the angel of the Lord had appeared in the flame. And when it says the angel of the Lord, this is not just an angel of the Lord. When it talks about the angel, the definite article, it's always talking about God himself. And more specifically, this is Jesus Christ before ever becoming a man in the flesh. So now as Moses, he gets closer, he sees this great sight and why this bush burns without being consumed. And then the bush calls to him. And if you had this happen to you, you would have thought you'd gone crazy and that you'd been alone in the wilderness way too long. And now this bush that knows his name, and the angel calls to him and says, Moses, Moses. And then he calls his name twice. And then now you find Moses, and he's answering back to the bush. And so if you didn't think he was crazy, you would think he was crazy now, because now he's talking to the bush. And Moses says, I'm here. Here I am. And Moses, he didn't see anyone in the bush, but God's presence was in the flame. And the first thing God said to him was to warn Moses to take off his shoes and to keep his distance. And so Moses, he never did ever get to look at that burning bush up close, because this is like God saying to him, stop, don't come any closer. And that's because there's always a distance between God and man, where God is holy. And this place is now holy. And it's holy because God is there. And it's not going to be defiled by a bunch of dirty shoes. All those places where you walked in the world getting yourself all dirty. So it's kind of like going to your grandmother's house and where she tells you to take off your shoes because you're not going to track all that dirt in here. And the angel of the Lord, he's already appeared a few times in the book of Genesis. We know that he appeared to Abraham at least twice, and that he also wrestled with Jacob before he met with his brother Esau. And when God calls your name twice, it implies that it's very important and that there's an urgency. And so the first thing God does is he tells Moses that he's not some kind of new God, but he's the same God that Moses had already heard of, the same God that he had heard of since he was a baby, the same God of his fathers. And then God calls his fathers by name. And he says the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And if you read that, we did, you saw that happen 3 times. So up to this point, we don't know if Moses ever really believed in God, or if he had just thought it was a bunch of stories that he had been told as a child. Before I was saved, I had no idea that Jesus was real and that Jesus was the real God, although I had heard of him because I was raised in the Catholic Church. But just like Moses here, until Jesus revealed himself to me as a person, I didn't know he was real. In fact, I would have believed God could have been anyone else because I had already heard of Jesus my whole life. And I didn't see him doing anything out of the ordinary in my life. But by God revealing himself, it makes all the difference. And so now Moses, he's afraid to look at the bush because now he knows that this is God. And I really like how God is real gentle with Moses and that he doesn't scare him. And Moses, he knows that he's not clean. And he knows that he's not holy. He has a deep sense that he's a sinner, and he knows that he's a murderer. And now God reveals to Moses that he has seen all the suffering of the Jews in Egypt, and he's heard them crying. And now it's time, and now he's ready to deliver them all. And so this also is a lot like today, where there are so many people where they don't know that God cares for them because they're looking at the circumstances that they're in and they're looking at their suffering. But it's not true. And even though it's difficult for them to believe that God sees them and that God cares for them, and then to tell these people that God also wants to deliver them, they have a real hard time believing that. But the truth is that God does these things in people's lives over and over and over. And he not only just delivers people from sin and death, but he also delivers us from anything that is not his will for us in our lives, anything that is not for our good, if we'll let him. And now I know there's a lot of people who will say, well, God has never delivered me. And they might go, well, he's never delivered me from the drugs or from the alcohol or from some other type of besetting sin that's oppressed them for a long time. And I remember I've struggled with some things. And I heard this pastor once say, God promises to deliver you from your enemies, but he never will deliver you from your friends. And so if those sins are your friends, he won't deliver you from them. So to be delivered from those kind of things, those things have to be your enemy. But to be clear, God, he still delivers people today from their burdens, and he always sees when we're oppressed, and he always cares about it. And so now God, he reveals his plan to Moses to bring the Jews to the land he promised to Abraham, flowing with milk and honey. And milk is referring to the pasture lands. And honey is referring to the fruitfulness with all the bees pollinating the flowering trees. And if it's not that, it means it's referring to all the date honey, because Israel is filled with all these date palms, and they boil the dates and they make the syrup and they call it date honey. And then God mentions all the different tribes of people living in the area. So Moses knows exactly where God is going to be sending them, that he is sending them to the land of Canaan. So now God, he invites Moses to come along with him on this adventurous journey, and that he will send Moses to Pharaoh. And you would almost think that Moses would say, great, I've always wanted to do this. I knew this was my calling in life, and I'm ready to go. But Moses, what he does is he gives God 5 reasons why he can't accept God's call. Now you have to remember, Moses, he's 80 years old here, and he's not the same man that he was when he left Egypt. That man is gone. Those days are over, along with his self-confidence. And sometimes when we get older, we try to escape our calling, because our callings, and when we're called, it costs us a lot. And if you read this, you will see that Moses pays quite a personal price to be able to lead God's people out of Egypt. But it's always worth it, because it's always rewarding to see God work. Because what you gain is you gain all this fellowship and intimacy with God as you are working together. And there is nothing else like that. And although Moses is arguing with God, I'm sure that he is really glad that he didn't argue his way out of it, because God didn't make Moses go. Moses went out of his own free will. He had a choice, because we always have a choice to obey God or not. And that's because God is always a gentleman. And God, he knows this man. And though Moses is arguing, God knows that Moses really wants to go. And God is so patient with him. And so God, he actually lets him argue. And so Moses' first reason why he can't do this is because he's a nobody. And he says, who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And so this is what Moses thinks of himself. He thinks he's a nobody. But it took a really long time to get Moses to this place. But here, Moses is just looking at himself. But who Moses is, it really doesn't matter. What matters is who God is. That's what matters. And so God says to Moses, he says, I'll be with you. And then God tells him, and I'll prove it to you. And this is going to be a sign to you that I sent you, because you're going to bring them all back right here. They're going to serve God right here on this mountain, right where you're standing. And a lot of times when we need to be delivered, we look at things the same way, where we look at ourselves, where we think we can be delivered and we can be delivered by our own power. If we just had enough faith, well, then we could do it. But we need to change our focus from ourselves to who God is. Because if we had the ability to deliver ourselves from our problems, we would have done it already. So we need to remove that faith from being in ourselves and from our abilities, and we need to place it on God and on his abilities. All right. So God tells Moses that he'll go with him, but that doesn't satisfy Moses. And so then Moses, he gives a second reason why he can't go. And he says, well, what am I going to say to him? What am I going to say to them? I don't even know your name. How am I going to introduce you? What am I going to say? The fire bush sent me. And if you remember 40 years ago, both of these groups, the Pharaoh and the Jews, they didn't quite like Moses all that much when he left Egypt. No one accepted him. In fact, they all pretty much chased him out of town. So what's going on here, it's not that Moses is really asking God what his name is, but what he's really asking him here is, what kind of God are you? Because God was already known to the patriarchs as being Jehovah, which is the same name as Yahweh. It's the same thing. And you see that Moses' mother's name was Jochebed, and that name has actually Jehovah in it. Her name is derived from Jehovah. Her name means Jehovah is my glory. And there are references to Jehovah throughout the whole book of Genesis. It's in Genesis 4:26, 14:22, 15:1, 25:21, 28:13, and 49:18. So they've already known his name is Yahweh and his name is Jehovah. And so what God tells Moses, he says that his name is I am who I am. And so what God is telling Moses here is that he is the self-existent one who always was and is and will be. And that name Jehovah and Yahweh, it's connected to the Hebrew verb to be. And so what God is saying, and what he's saying that he's saying, I am all the things you will need. And so it has this sense of meaning the becoming one. And we saw Jesus, that he used I am all the time in his teachings, where he would say, I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the door. I am the truth and the life. And the Jews, they always knew what Jesus was saying when he did call himself I am, that he knew that he was saying the name of God. And then God says that this will be his name forever, Yahweh Elohim. And then God, he goes into this great detailed plan. And what he's going to tell him to do, it's just going to be this small request. It's just a 3-day journey into the wilderness to sacrifice. And that actually wouldn't have been an unusual request. Other slaves were granted time to travel and to be able to worship their gods. So really, Pharaoh, he would have not had an excuse to refuse this request, except for his hatred of the Jews.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,